Hi, my name is Koshi Nakanishi and I'm the director of Resident Evil Requiem. Hello, my name's Masato Kumazawa and I'm the producer of Resident Evil Requiem. The section in the demo that we're showing here at Gamescom is from towards the start of the game, and the protagonist Grace finds herself kidnapped by some sort of mysterious entity or organization, and she's literally strapped upside down to a table and has no idea what's going on. She frees herself only to find that she's being pursued around this location by a bizarre, monstrous creature. So, needless to say, from that description, of all the different aspects of Resident Evil games, this demo section is firmly focused on horror. The start point for her is to be incredibly vulnerable and helpless. She hasn't got any weapons on her and she's completely unaccustomed to being thrown into this kind of intense situation. But she goes on a journey and you'll go with her too. She will grow throughout the game and gradually become more competent and capable and overcome her fear somewhat. She will naturally find weapons eventually and be able to, grab guns and shoot back at the horrors that await her. So she doesn't stay in this completely terrified, helpless state throughout the whole game. I think each Resident Evil title has these sort of standalone parts where maybe you don't have the weapons you're used to, and we can increase the horror feeling with that. And as I said, we kind of structurally brought that horror aspect to the forefront right at the start of the game in order to gel with the characterization of Grace, who's of someone who is completely unfamiliar with and not expecting to be thrown into such a horrible situation. But we want to add something fresh as well. So, rather than just sort of copying and pasting over House Bienvenido, things like the mechanism for how you protect yourself from the creature in the demo, and the creature itself and its design and how it feels to be pursued by it in this section are something that I think bring another level to that concept of the claustrophobic, unarmed character section of the game.
What the hell was that thing?
I think it's a common experience with Resident Evil games where we don't exactly pick up the exact thread that was left on the previous game. Resident Evil 6 ended on a sort of tease of Jake, the character from that game, possibly seeing where he might go next, and then Resident Evil 7 was a totally different protagonist, for example. So there's a lot of parallel threads in motion, and I think we just choose where we're going to focus our spotlight at any given time. It doesn't mean those other characters aren't out there somewhere sort of getting on with business, but we're just not showing you just yet. So although at the end of Village we saw Chris Redfield at the BSAA in action, we decided to return to the more general mainline story of the series for this entry. So it's looking towards Raccoon City and kind of, after so many years not having seen this location, catching up on where we're at with that and picking that up as the main thread. So rest assured, I'm sure Chris is out in action somewhere in the world, but for now we're not really looking at him and we're looking at somewhere different. We did essentially start with the existing design and layout of Raccoon City as has been seen most recently in Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. I won't say we went into like a physics simulation of exactly how it was affected by the bomb that was the sort of the biological weapon that was used on it, but we thought it through. We were like, okay, well, this is where the bomb landed in the city, then this would be the blast zone, the shockwave would maybe travel into these areas and that's how they'd be affected. And I wanted to have a certain level of believability to that while still having creative freedom to design this new updated version. At the same time, you want to keep some of those iconic places, and even if it's not necessarily realistic that they wouldn't be reduced to rubble, things like the RPD gate that we've been showing, you want to keep some of those iconic locations recognizable and something for fans to point to. I think it also gives it a sense of tragedy and loss to look at the ruins of something that you thought you knew so well from the past games when they're intact, and to see them crumbling and barely there. It's got a poignancy to it that I wanted to have as a bit of an edge to that depiction of Raccoon City as it stands today, 30 years after the incident. Resident Evil 4 Remake and Village are somewhat more on the action side of the series in terms of the mixture of elements that they have. Requiem is something different. If I had to compare it to past titles, it's more along the lines of Resident Evil 7 or the Resident Evil 2 remake. You could call it so-called old school Resident Evil, with exploration and backtracking and that kind of thing. So it's more hewing closely to those. It does, of course, feature all the classic core pillars of Resident Evil features that everyone knows and loves, such as combat, exploration, puzzle solving, resource management of limited number of items, and we've given it our own spin this time for Resident Evil Requiem's sort of game atmosphere. Speaking then to Resident Evil 7 and 2, I think they reflect a typical game design that we have for this series where, you can't keep the horror tension to the max through the whole game because it's quite exhausting. So you need to have this kind of dynamic pacing curve where you'll have a very tense, horrific sequence, and then we give you a bit of a release or a catharsis from that and let you sort of come down from that with more slightly peaceful exploration or some exciting combat, and then we gradually bring you back up the horror part of the curve. Again, that's the sort of standard practice for Resident Evil. The difference this time is there's a new system that I can't quite get into yet, but if you think of the difference between the tension and the release being a certain sort of size of wavelength, as it were, of that curve, I want to make the distance between those aspects like bigger than ever before in the series, and it just becomes a complete roller coaster ride between the different aspects of the series, and I'm very excited for people to eventually understand what I mean by that. We're definitely going to play around with your emotions a lot with this one.
Not this way, not this way.
We've had sort of two strands recently with the series, the third-person remakes of Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4, and then the first-person perspective 7 and Village. And naturally, the player base can tend to sort of fall on either side depending on your preferences of viewpoint and how comfortable you find each viewpoint. So by combining them both in this game and giving you the option, what we're basically saying is regardless of which sub-series of the game you like, then you can play Requiem in that style that suits you. On reflection though, looking back at Resident Evil 7's first-person perspective, I implemented that as a way to make it more immersive and more scary than ever before, which I think most media and players agreed it was an incredibly scary game, but it was possibly too scary. I think some people couldn't handle it and either couldn't finish it or didn't even start it. And that's something that I look back on thinking that, I want to make sure that people can enjoy this game. So if you started the game off in first-person perspective and you're finding it's too much, then third-person is almost a way to step slightly back from that level of horror and make it slightly easier to deal with by having the character on screen as a kind of avatar of yourself, and it's it makes it slightly less hitting close. Including both perspectives wasn't exactly twice as difficult. There were some aspects where we had to make adjustments for each one, but what we found was that if you just take the camera out of the character's head and show the third person, if you don't tweak it and add in more animation and characterization to them, then they look quite unnatural and robotic, because the first person version of them is just running along and they wouldn't be reacting to anything because you couldn't see those reactions in first person, right? So an example in the demo is that if you played in third person in a certain scene, Grace actually trips and stumbles over herself. She's so scared when she's running away from the creature. That doesn't happen in first person because making the camera move like that in first person would be very unnatural and possibly even uncomfortable. So that's a third person specific tweak that we added to make up for the fact that it's not quite as immersive, but you can almost empathize with the character more when you see them on screen, and it almost makes you panic because you see her panicking and you think like, this is serious. And it's two different ways to get across to the player what kind of emotion we want them to be feeling and how we want them to be scared for the character, whether that's by seeing through their eyes or on their behalf by looking at expressions and reactions and their different motions. And throughout the game we ended up adding lots of tiny tweaks like that to make both perspectives have their own different take on the horror that you're going to feel. Resident Evil Requiem is coming to PlayStation 5, Xbox Series XS and Steam on 27 February 2026. I hope you're excited for it and look forward to it.